I wanted to touch upon a certain aspect of Tsongkhapa, a specific aspect of Tsongkhapa, which is more mystical, dimension, which don't really get much attention, particularly in the West, in the contemporary literature. Partly because his identity as a great scholar, a great thinker, a great philosopher, a reformer is so dominant. And many of his major texts have been translated into English. So whether it's an academic community or a Western Buddhist world or, kind of contemporary thinkers who are interested in engaging with Tsongkhapa's thought, not as a Buddhist, but in a global kind of, host of ideas kind of approach, the engagement with Tsongkhapa tends to be very dominated from those angles. And so much so that very little space is left to these other aspects, which was very, very important for him. So, and I tried to bring that out in my biography, the modern biography that I wrote. But one of the things that fascinates me about that particular aspect of Tsongkhapa's life, and by the way, it isn't that unusual for a historical Tibetan master. That dimension of life would be found in the lives of many great masters. But what was interesting to me is, we know from Tsongkhapa's writings that he was a great philosopher. He was probably one of the few in the history of religious thought in general, philosophy in particular, and more specifically Tibetan tradition, where he genuinely believed in the human thought and reason's potential for liberation. I mean, ultimately, as a Buddhist, he does agree that the highest state of enlightenment is beyond thought, beyond language, beyond dichotomy. It's a state beyond duality. But he took it very seriously that just because the ultimate state is beyond thought and beyond language doesn't mean we dumped language and thought on the path. And here there's a beautiful passage in one of the later Tibetan writers who compare the human language and thought to the aid that is provided by a walking stick for an elderly man. So an elderly man is able to get around by relying on the help of a walking stick. So this master also says that the language and thought are like that. We should not get fixated on the language and thought itself, but the language and thought are means by which we will be able to get to where we want to go. So this is one area where Tsongkhapa has really striven very deeply to really kind of push the limits to which human thoughts and language, particularly thought, can be refined. And he makes a distinction between disciplined application of thought and kind of, random thoughts that tend to arise in the form of rumination. That and the Indian Buddhist epistemology reminds us the function of thought is just the internal chatter. It's the thought, we don't have to will thought. Thoughts just will come. And that's the nature of thought. When thought arises, they have a free-flowing, kind of, energy of its own. That's one of the reasons why someone like Salman Rushdie's writing is very powerful, because Salman Rushdie doesn't write in this clean, linear, structured way which many writers write. Rushdie's power of telling the story comes from the fact that he's able to capture the messiness of the style of human thinking. I mean, that's at least how I see it. So what Tsongkhapa is suggesting is that there is a fundamental distinction between a disciplined application of thought versus, just ruminations that pop up, and which are generally driven by habitual patterns. And then and furthermore, now a modern psychology shows us that actually many of the ruminating nature of thoughts tend to be about ourselves. It's a self-oriented thought. It's about, and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition teaches us that our thoughts generally tend to be about anticipation of what's going to come, driven by hopes and fears and expectations, or something looking backwards into the past, in form of resentment, regret, whatever, rejoicing. So very rarely do we actually stay in the present. And that's one of the reasons why modern mindfulness is turning out to be very powerful and efficacious technique for the contemporary secular world, because it teaches the technique to somehow refrain from this tendency to either move back in the past or project in the future, and learn some skills to stay in the present. So we know, and then also the contemporary science shows us that a large part of this free-flowing ruminatory kind of thoughts is really about me. It's very self-focused. And in fact, the brain regions of self-orientation and rumination actually overlaps. So that's so there's a reason for that. But what I want to get at is that Tsongkhapa genuinely believed in the power of disciplining human thought and then finding a way to apply it. Now, that does presuppose some basic skills to quieten your mind and settle it, so that it doesn't get immediately taken over, and which also requires a basic attentional training, because attention in a natural, normal state, attention arises because there is a new information that we are experiencing. There's a novelty. That's one of the reasons why modern films and entertainment, they are so fast moving, because they need to present new information quickly so that you don't get bored, or attention is triggered by something that is fearful. So we know when we are afraid, we have a very acute attentional ability. But what the contemplative practice is teaching us is the ability to cultivate attention so that we can sustain our attention in a deliberate way.